My development as a teacher. This is an audio article which shares a few experiences and perspectives that have come my way over the years. I am one of those teachers who finds my profession to be more than just a job. Sometimes it is expedient to control my natural enthusiasm and tendency to delve deeper into the many issues surrounding learning and teaching, at least when interacting with my colleagues or the administration. By the way, I've never had a problem being an enthusiastic teacher with my students. For many, teaching is just a job, and people who consider it more than that are sometimes regarded as suspect. It's safer for such teachers to fit in with the world around them, including adhering to the current systems and ways of doing things. So, for survival, I have learned to balance dealing with imposed systems and my own yearning to explore further that which can be or could be. I consider myself very fortunate by being born into an era that was freer in some aspects. There were systems back then too, and things were far from ideal as well. Still, for the most part, those ways suited my personality and approach to life better. For example, upon receiving the job, we new teachers were quickly thrown into the battlefield. I'm talking about the private world of teaching, where a teacher works for a business or commercial academy, and once you are signed on, you now have the title of being a teacher, and therefore you are a teacher. In that era, as incredible as it sounds, you didn't need any teaching degree, certificate, or experience. Native speakers got interviews immediately, and non-natives were accepted in many places too, but had to have a good level of English. Interestingly, in many public school systems in many non-English countries, English language teachers were often non-natives who had very little understanding and experience with the language. But they could get by using lengthy explanations in their native language and focus on approaches that were not very communicative in nature. If you got the job in a private academy, you were given a timetable, some classes to teach, and the course books to follow. Soon you were at the front of the classroom, standing before an array of student faces who were sizing you up and wondering how this course was going to turn out. In most schools at that time, we were given little or no training prior to starting to teach. However, once hired, there were meetings where somebody in administration would tell or remind us that punctuality, good appearance, and completion of all the paperwork were of prime importance. Some schools had one or more induction days, just prior to the start of a new academic year, where new and returning teaching staff would meet and perhaps exchange ideas on how to use a new course book or start the first class. Some of the schools would even hold workshops during the year on how to deal with some of the issues surrounding teaching, for example, teaching kids or evaluating students' writing. It was not uncommon for the school to pay some or all the fees for a teacher to register for a teachers' conference and take in some talks or workshops while they attended. Some schools still do this, but most have meetings to show how the latest apps or technology are to be used, not so much focusing on how to be a better teacher. Nowadays, it is more important to use the technology and to follow systems set by the school. There still may be a few options for the teachers to approach their teaching in different ways, but often they are defined in a ready-made listing of references, and more the schools want to see evidence of their teachers drawing from those particular pools of resources. I was fortunate in that the school which first hired me gave me a 5-day training course covering some fundamentals of what teaching involves, and the opportunity to observe an experienced teacher conducting her class. I thought she was amazing, and if I could reach half of her abilities and skill set in the future years, I would consider myself a good teacher and in the right profession. She was a true blessing, and because of her openness to deal with my many naive questions, I was able to start my classes with some element of direction and purpose. I didn't have any teaching qualifications, not even the 30-day teaching certificate. Almost all of my learning would come from my direct experiences as I learned while on the job, and often efforts outside of the classroom as I tried to bring my level of expertise up. It was hard, very hard, and part of the many difficulties was not even knowing all the challenges I was facing. I just knew I had a lot to learn, but often I wasn't sure just what those things were. I stumbled through so much, including long hours the night before my classes, trying to work out the grammar of my own language and ways I could effectively help the students. At least, that was my intention. As my experiences accumulated and developed, I discovered that if my connection with the students was a good one, that if I was open to discovering what their needs and interests might be, and that if I was determined to learn and grow and find ways to help them, then they were more open to learning. I could rarely answer well those questions thrown at me in those first few years, but they were clues to show me where I had to place some of my efforts in further explorations. Still, in monitoring the students and encouraging honest but constructive feedback from them, I saw that many well-intentioned activities weren't working as I had hoped and anticipated. Also fortunate for me was that my reaction to my lesson plans and to my activities falling short of my expectations, well, that reaction wasn't one of complete dismay and surrender. It often fed my motivation to try harder, to be more open, even creative in considering and employing alternative approaches. It was extra work and not so easy, but I was so happy to be in a profession where I actually wanted to work and develop myself further. I felt inspired, much more than discouraged. Again, it was the students and my own initiative that fueled the desire to get better as a teacher, not so much the school or administration. However, schools at that time were more open to teachers wanting to develop their teaching, and they did encourage exploration and experimentation to some degree. Their openness to the diversity in approach and style in their teachers definitely contributed to me wanting to improve personally, as well as wanting to be part of the school. They accepted me and my ways, and other teachers and their ways, and that made me more open to accepting the school and its ways. Unfortunately, nowadays many schools take pride in having only one way of approaching teaching and students, their way. It would have been easier for me to have gone the more traditional route, and I've studied and followed the traditional views on how to approach teaching. However, that wasn't the situation I was in. Still, in that day and age, there was more flexibility. You were placed in situations and expected to do well. Maybe not at first, but through your own initiative, you would get better. And usually, there was somebody, somewhere in the school, who was open to offering some words of advice and support. If the students were reasonably content, and I could cope with the demands placed on me, not to mention those that I placed on myself, then I could probably expect a new contract the following year. In many schools, they gave you your books and you had to return them at the end of the academic year. During that time, you could do what you wanted to somehow get the students through the course and get most to pass the final exams. It was hard because there was a very real lack of direction and there weren't many resources. But because you were allowed to interpret the paths you felt best for you and your students, there was an incredible sense of freedom, including the freedom to make mistakes and to try again another way. We also had the time to explore and do extra things. Not like now where we have to find miracles to meet the many expectations placed on us. Because of that freedom, I had more responsibilities and were cut out for me in some ways, as I tried to shape the class into going towards productive directions. I flourished in that environment. My first 2 or 3 years were very stressful, but were also incredibly rewarding. The students appreciated the freshness and the dedication I brought to the classroom, and they responded in a positive way. I learned to find time and energy for each of the individual students and for the class as a group. When the class makeup of students was more conservative in nature, so was I, and the directions we took. If they were open to theater, to contributing to a class magazine to be published at the end of the course, to simulations, to giving presentations, then we did just that. But it wasn't simply willy-nilly superficial fun activities. I always made an extra effort to mix in with those freer, more creative ways a solid base of structure, direction, and practice. In my youth, I enjoyed many things, one of which was the martial arts. One style viewed interacting with life at times similar to that of surviving on your own in the jungle. That meant within the first month of matriculation, I was already sparring with another person. There were injuries as to be expected. In fact, those injuries were viewed as an incentive to clean up your act and learn faster and better. The whole idea was to immerse yourself, to jump into the situation, to deal with it. That's how you learn. Another style was much more conservative. We weren't allowed to spar freestyle until after acquiring many belts. We had to dedicate ourselves to building up a strong foundation and demonstrate our understanding and expertise before entering the arena of somewhat freer interaction. All this was before and during the time I was becoming an English language teacher. I noticed that my students, when learning English, felt more secure with a more conservative approach. It was safe and predictable, and following the expected ways, over time, one would pass the exams and rise through the levels. But there were many who felt they weren't ready yet to use their English in the real world, just in the controlled atmospheres built up in the classroom. One example of this was after spending a good part of a class on giving directions. They would leave the school and suddenly encounter a foreigner asking them for directions. Here was a wonderful opportunity to put into practice what we had just been studying. There were some that rose to the challenge, but many felt their developing English language minds go blank immediately on the onset of having a foreigner speak to them in English. They couldn't retrieve any of the expressions or knowledge that they had been working on in their English classes. Incidents such as these have sparked me into deliberately and actively combining both elements of those different martial arts styles when approaching my teaching and the students' learning. I feel the students need both, a solid foundation and direction to draw from, and to become familiar with using the language, sometimes in less predictable and more spontaneous situations. The spontaneity could come about when student input and playful exploration is encouraged. There are moments in the class that I take their hand and lead them through some of the murky waters, supplying them with organized references, clarity where possible, and their own experiences which can aid them getting through the demands of an activity. And there are other moments in the class where I throw them in the water, and they have to swim for themselves, at least within the limits they have at that time. The latter sounds quite severe, but it really isn't, because there's always a warm blanket of support accompanying the expectations of them fending for themselves. They learn how to find direction and confidence, and possible references to use in those interactions. I show them some ways that they can achieve the goals, those set by me and those they set for themselves. If those don't work, we search together for other ways. We define progress as something relative for each individual, for the group, for the activity, and for the bigger picture. They learn to help themselves and each other, learning that there are shared challenges to overcome, and that perhaps there has to be some shifting of expectations and perspectives to better evaluate and appreciate that progress. They learn that some approaches in the class may be less appealing to them personally than others, but there will always be some that can reach them better, and those other approaches can not only help other students in their ways, but can be useful in reinforcing what they are learning too. As I get to know my students, I find I can understand what works for them and stylize each class so we all feel better about it. Frequently, this is not as time-consuming as it might appear, because on the whole, most students face very similar challenges. Stylizing activities could include the possibility of what kind of group work to employ, or who to place in those groups. It could involve considering how to present a new area, or a form of review, or further practice. It definitely includes listening to the students, seeing how they react to different approaches, and fine-tuning those perceptions. It does require at least a little more work and investment than simply following a system or a preset lesson plan, even if that lesson plan is one that I developed and it had proved successful in the past. That extra time and effort for me and for the students goes a long way, because we more frequently feel that the time we spend together is worthwhile and rewarding. That kind of job satisfaction is not so easily found in other jobs, although it can be there too. Another idea related to all this is, in spite of my growing experience and working knowledge of how things can work in the classroom, is that of improvisation and spontaneity. As I am about to leave the teacher's room, you won't hear a groan from me or the words lamenting the fact that I have to teach the past simple to yet another group. I enter the classroom in some ways like a performer entering a small, intimate setting of a small audience. Every concert is different with its own personality, its own energy and dynamics. I have my plan for the class and my anticipated expectations, but I am not a slave to that. As much as possible, we have a syllabus to follow and get through, but each class is different. Much depends on who is attending that class and how they are feeling. Much depends on how that last class went, or the last two classes. And much depends on my and our bigger, long-range objectives for everyone involved. I come to class prepared with my materials, my lesson plan, my expectations, but each class is different. Plans get modified, adapting to the situation. How long we spend on an activity, how the students are exploring it, and what I can do to enhance it depends on the dynamic of the moment and the class as it is unfolding. This makes the experiences we have more real and meaningful, and allows a more spontaneous and heartfelt way to treat each class. Over the years, I've studied a lot on my own, taking courses and workshops, and started giving my own talks and workshops. I have seen my skills, my abilities, and my confidence grow as a teacher, and later as a teacher trainer. I've worked in administration, where I have been charged with observing and evaluating teachers. That has been truly educational for me. I've seen teachers very different from myself in many ways, and on many occasions they are effective and excellent in many aspects. More than anything, it has helped me appreciate the diversity of teachers that we are, and that different students can be taught in different ways. I've grown to feel that the way I do things is good for me, especially mixed in with the current reality of how things are, and especially with the students I have. I also feel that other ways can be just as good or even better, depending on the situations, the students, and who's teaching them. I am saddened by this modern tendency building up momentum where adhering to one system only is considered the only way. It is more than valuing convenience over individual differences, but perhaps that is the era that we are entering. I want to keep an open mind, and there is no doubt that artificial intelligence and new technology in general is taking over. Perhaps as it evolves, each student will have it all customized just for them, and they can maximize their learning potential through virtual classes. Or maybe students will no longer be students. Perhaps the whole idea of learning can be eliminated with successful use of implants or headsets or other types of technology, such as instant translation, both in reception and in transmission, which will be simple, cheap, and effective. We are not there yet, so during this period of transition, we seem to be doing a mix, blending technology in with our current approaches and personal touches. For those of you so inclined, I would suggest not to give up those personal touches of exploration, desires to improve and find out more, enjoyment of facing challenges and human contact, and knowing what it means to be part of something, including struggling through a period to gain a deeper and vaster understanding of what can be possible. You may be obliged to follow systems, but they still have rough edges and gaps, and if you don't mind the extra effort, you can take advantage of them and place yourself in there, growing from the experience. We can set up and nourish an environment where we can explore not just the course content, but also ourselves. There are new perspectives and discoveries to experience. In being a good teacher, we teach more than the content of the courses. We have the opportunity to show that effort makes a difference, that all people can be appreciated, perhaps in different ways, and that as different as we are, we all have something to contribute. When your students walk out the door, they are not only a little more confident or familiar with some aspect of their English use and understanding, they also feel a little better about themselves and their interactions with others. And we teachers can walk out the same door feeling the same way. In my opinion, teachers will become technicians, and then years later possibly obsolete, except in special cases, perhaps in retro counterculture or during occasional splashes when it becomes fashionable for a while. For a longer while, though, children will need human contact, and there will be a few situations where humans will be working alongside technology rather than being replaced entirely. All indications seem to point to a greater reliance and use of technology, and for most, if not all kinds of teachers and subject matter. I'm not advocating to stop the use of technology and systems, but I think we can use them better to accommodate and respect individual differences and our self-development as teachers and as people. For me, my teaching, my classes, my students, it was all best when we took on the attitude of working together, learning from and adjusting to each other, of exploration and curiosity, and a desire to be more familiar with perceiving and working towards our objectives. Once we had a taste of that environment, we all welcomed it and strived to maintain and develop it further. Perhaps in this transition period into a greater reliance on technology, we can adopt a similar attitude and approach. Well, those are some of my thoughts and experiences as I have developed as a teacher. I wish you all the best in your development as a teacher, as a student, as to getting involved and exploring and perceiving your endeavors.